Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this beautiful line and wash painting of a Welsh coastal scene using a limited palette. But first, a quick peep at my new book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Tips and Techniques for the Complete Beginner, which is now available to order or pre-order depending on where in the world you are and which shop you choose. And now back to the demo. This is the photograph from Pixabay that I've used as inspiration, and I've really simplified it quite a lot, as you could see. I'll leave a link to the photograph in the description below. Something like this would be great for beginners to try because the drawing itself is quite simple. Just observe the shape of the cliff and just put in a simplified outline and place in the tiny little building on the cliffs, the horizon line, a few marks for where your waves will be, and then you can go in and go over your pencil outline once it's right with waterproof fine liners. I'm using a 0.5 nib Pigma Micron waterproof fine liner, and you can see all I'm doing is just again keeping it really simple. I'll put a bit of shading in a minute on the cliffs, and that will help me to get the tones right when I come to paint. But this outline gives us a structure, and this is why this line and wash technique is so good for beginners, because not only does it help you to learn to simplify from photographs and to observe, but it also improves your drawing skills and gives you a nice structure on which to place your watercolour washes. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a bit of masking fluid. This is Pebeo drawing gum, and I'm going to paint a little bit of it over the building on the cliff. That will mean that it will protect the white of the paper, and I can paint my washes freely over the top of that, and then I can remove the masking fluid later and just add a little bit of colour to the building's roof so it stands out really nicely. I'm painting the sky wet in wet, so using a large mop brush, I'm wetting the sky. If you look carefully at the screen, you can see that I'm painting around clouds, leaving them as unpainted paper. So in a way, with clean water, I'm having a bit of a practice run at my sky, and then wetting the sea area across the cliffs as well, because I don't need to keep them light. And then this is a mixture of cobalt blue, ultramarine and a touch of cerulean, but you can use any blue that you like to use for this. And then paint in your sky using a large wash brush, working around the clouds that you left dry, softening around the edges as you go. I'm using a piece of Milford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees. You can see that gravity is drawing the paint down, but I can soften any runs using the damp brush, anything that's sort of running down the page a little bit. And I can also use the brush just to lift out a little bit of extra cloud, which means removing any moisture from the brush so it's just damp, and then just lifting out paint with that thirsty brush, as it's known, when it's just clean and damp like that. Bringing some of that same light sky colour over the cliffs, because they will all be a lot darker, into the sea, leaving gaps of unpainted white paper for my waves and some light on the water, and I'll bring a little bit of that very pale blue across the beach. This just starts off the beach colour, and I can warm it up by adding a little bit of burnt sienna to that colour and then dragging that across the beach, and that begins to give me a nice base for my beach. So I've mixed up a darker colour with my ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and a little bit of Payne's grey, a nice light value of that dark colour, and I'm just dropping it quickly into the cliff face where I want them a little bit darker, and then a little bit of that darker colour across the tape at the bottom, and a little bit of that across the waterline where I'd like just to suggest wet sand at the water's edge. Now this is a clean, damp mop brush, and I'm quickly going to lift out a little bit more cloud above the cottage. And now, using a mixture of sap green, hooker's green and a touch of burnt sienna, I'm going to put in the undercoat for the cliff top grass and trees. A darker, richer mix across the cliff on either side of the cottage will help it to stand out really beautifully. I'm now going to leave it to dry completely and then come back and work on the next stage. Here's the dry painting. It's dried back quite nicely. The next thing I'm going to do is darken up the sea colour a little. And so I'm going to take my sky colour, and into it I'm going to add a bit of my hooker's green. Just to kind of green that blue down a bit. And this is a small flat brush, carefully painting along the horizon line to make sure I keep the horizon line nice and straight with this greenish blue. And then I'll slowly work across the sea in the distance, adding this lovely dark colour, feathering it out as I come closer towards the front, making sure I leave some little gaps of that paler underpainting showing through for sort of lighter reflective marks on the sea, maybe a little bit of surf, that sort of thing. I'm keeping my brush strokes horizontal, and you can see that as I approach the tide line that paint is running out on the brush and becoming a bit paler, and this helps to integrate it with the churning surf closer to the tide line. Still keeping preserving my areas of white paper to suggest those lighter areas of the shore. I've now dipped back into the darker colour, and I'm dropping a few darker lowlights into the foreground waves. And then dragging that colour over just to give me that look of wet sand. And now just glazing over the sand with a light value glaze of burnt sienna with a dab of cobalt blue in it, and that just warms it up a bit. And because watercolour is transparent, you can see the underpainting through this glaze. I'm now going to mix up a dark and get in those really deep shadows onto the cliffs. I've made this with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue and a little touch of Payne's grey. I'm following the pencil lines that I put in, which indicated where the deep shadows would be. And I shall work across the distant cliff and then come to this slightly closer middle ground cliff. Painting in all the shadows, but trying to leave the little rocks at the foot of the cliffs unpainted. So I'm going to be painting around them just so they stand out a bit more. I'm going in quite dark to start with because the shadows are very dark in the photograph and I like the contrast there. But this should lighten back quite a lot as it dries, because watercolour usually dries back about 30% lighter. But if it looks like it's staying a bit too dark, just before it dries, I'll probably dab a little bit of that colour out. Notice I'm painting around the small rocks at the base of the cliffs. This helps to give a little bit of shape and form and also depth and distance. I'm now going to use my palette knife and just carefully scrape a few verticals, of jaggedy vertical lines down the cliffs, just to add a bit of texture, following the lines that I put in with the line work at the beginning. And I forgot to mention that I have removed the masking fluid from my little building, and I'll be painting that in a bit later. But first I'm going to add a bit more richer, deeper value green, using the same mix of hooker's green, sap green and a touch of burnt sienna, working around the building and then changing up the value very slightly just to add a bit of variety and depth and distance. Making sure my brush strokes follow the direction of the lay of the land, which helps to create the illusion of the grass and little bushes and trees on top of the cliffs. I've added a touch of blue to my beach colour, and I'm now going to paint in my far distant headland, keeping it nice and flat across the horizon line. And now a small brush and just a quick dab of burnt sienna onto the roof. This really makes the buildings stand out beautifully. And a little bit of ultramarine blue, very pale value, just to put a bit of shadow on the front of the building, so it's just the gable end that's catching the light. A final drag of this lovely dark sandy colour across the beach here and there, just to darken it up across the foreground and add a little bit more tone, a bit more texture to that sort of wet sandy look. And just before they dry, I'm going to use a paper tissue or paper towel to lift off a little bit of the damp paint on the cliff, because I've decided that they're drying a little bit too dark. So at the top of the cliff, you can see I'm lightening up the cliff a little bit. So I'm keeping that darker area of shadow at the base of the cliffs, which helps the little rocks at the bottom of the cliffs to show up. So I'm going to call that finished, and I'm going to remove the tape and see how it looks with its clean white border, which always helps us to see the painting with fresh eyes, and we can see if we need to do anything else to it. I could add more texture, sort of shingles, stones, bits of seaweed, etc. to the beach, but I'm deliberately leaving it plain. I want to keep this nice and simple for beginners, and the beach really only serves the purpose of leading the eye across the painting towards the cliff and the cottage, which is, of course, our point of interest, and then up and across to our sky, which is lovely and loose. Well, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. It's free to do and it really helps with our reach with the YouTube algorithm. And thank you so much to everybody that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.